From the Oregon State University Extension Service, this is Pollination, a podcast that tells the stories of researchers, land managers, and people like you who are making bold strides to improve the health of pollinators. I'm your host, Dr. Adoni Melathopoulos, Associate Professor of Pollinator Health in the Department of Horticulture. Spring is in the air in Western Oregon with it's not going to be long before bumblebee queens emerge from hibernation and they're going to go out to found a nest. Now, many of you probably know from a podcast that we did with Steve Gomes, nest founding for bumblebee queens is particularly perilous. They're doing it at a time of year it's really cold out. And in addition, as we're going to hear in this episode, after a colony has started, another bumblebee might try to come in and usurp or take over the nest. Now, my next guest has noticed that this natural behavior of bumblebee queens trying to take over another bumblebee queen's nest has led to some peril when it comes to commercial bumblebee colonies. Dr. Heather Grab is a senior lecturer in the School of Integrative Plant Sciences at Cornell University, and along with undergraduate researcher Olivia Miller, they discovered that these commercial bumblebee colonies can be a death trap for wild bumblebee colonies that inadvertently try to take over what they think is a small little nest, but run into a huge commercial bumblebee colony and frequently die. It's a fascinating story, great research, and the methodologies are so inventive and simple. You're going to really love this episode this week on Pollination with Dr. Heather Grab. Well, welcome, Dr. Grab, to Pollination.
It is such a pleasure to be here and to speak with your audience.
Well, I'm really excited to talk with you. I had there was a group of us that were send around scientific papers, part of a big blueberry pollination project, and your paper was sent to the whole group, and there was a lot of discussion that was about this finding that you have around managed bumblebee queens. And I guess maybe just to start with, I think for us, we knew that people are using managed bumblebee colonies, but maybe our guests aren't aware of this. Tell us a little bit about managed bumblebees and how, growers who need pollination are using them.
Sure. Yeah. First, it makes me so excited to hear that other researchers are catching on to this and are excited about it also, because I feel like this is in my early career so far, this has been one of the cooler results that we have found. So getting back to your question about what are managed pollinators, in particular, managed bumblebee colonies, of course, we also have wild, unmanaged bumblebee colonies, many different species throughout the U.S. that are nesting in our urban areas and rural areas and agricultural systems and providing important pollination services. But unlike some of the other managed bees, so, the one that we're probably all most familiar with is the European honeybee. Bumblebees can also be managed in their colonies. There's some big, differences between them, though. Of course, managed bumblebee colonies are annual. They tend to be a little bit smaller in terms of the size and the number of workers, but they also have some unique benefits as well. So managed bumblebee colonies tend to forage at lower temperatures than honeybees like to forage at. So especially for growers who are producing early spring crops that we might have a lot of weather impacting during pollination events, having a different pollinator in their toolkit for pollination can help them to ensure that they're going to get good pollination services. The other place that we see bumblebees being used a lot for commercial pollination purposes is in greenhouses and other controlled environments. So often for things like tomato pollination in greenhouses, we see bumblebees doing really well there because they can pretty easily learn to navigate in that environment that has a lot of interesting, like the lights are very different, whereas if you put a honeybee colony into a greenhouse, mostly what you would see is a lot of honeybees up at the roof of the greenhouse.
I have seen that, yeah.
And go elsewhere. And
we don't like it.
Very few of them doing pollination, whereas bumblebees just seem to be much more adaptable to providing pollination services in that environment. And of course, bumblebees have the ability to do buzz pollination. So crops like the tomatoes I mentioned earlier that we're growing in greenhouses require sonication in order to release their pollen. And bumblebees are able to achieve that really effectively, whereas honeybees don't do that specialized pollination behavior.
I think people have heard of this before, and you can audibly hear, bumblebee on a tomato. It will really, I guess that the pollen isn't exposed like you would have on a, I don't know, on a cherry blossom, but it's in a tube, I guess.
Yes. Yeah. And so, unlike managed honeybees, where you have a huge network of different apiculturists who are managing colonies, of course, we also have people who are managing colonies in their backyards for honey production. Bumblebees are produced in a much more, I would call it sort of like an industrial system. There's some really big producers, two main producers here in the US and North America that are providing these individual colonies. And again, they only last for a year. So you would order one of these from one of these companies or from somebody who's working with a company that can provide some colonies for your pollination purposes. They're not giving you honey. They're not, I mean, they do make wax structures in the hives, but you wouldn't really make candles or anything else out of the wax that comes
Uh-huh.
out of the bumblebee colony. So the really main utility of a managed bumblebee colony is just for that pollination service. You get them in a small square box, or sometimes growers will order them in what's called a quad. So it's like 4 independent colonies that all come together in one big box that they can place out in the middle of one of their fields. And then the foragers will go out and do their thing pollinating the crops around.
Okay, so these individual colonies are these kind of like 4 colonies packaged into one box. I remember seeing them. They look like they're in like a corrugated cardboard shell, but inside, if you open it up, there's a little, I guess, a little bumblebee nest ready to go, and I guess they have a entrance that they come in and out of,
Yes, yeah, there's
like
a
a little
couple
hole.
standard features of these bumblebee colonies. So they usually come in sort of inside the cardboard area. There's a little plastic container that's pretty secure, which is good. Occasionally bees will escape out, which is not great if you're working with
Oh
them
yeah.
indoors in the lab and you don't want them to escape. But that also helps to protect the colony from things that might come around and try to get in, like skunks or raccoons, et cetera. Oftentimes they'll be shipped with a little bit of pollen supply that helps to carry those bees over, and a nectar container that's in the bottom of the colony. And then they have a little door that you can, as soon as you get your colony, you're ready to deploy it out in the field, you can open up that door. Or in the case of a greenhouse, where you can imagine you might want to get some pollination services and then move it into another greenhouse chamber, but you don't want to lose all your bees in the first chamber. You can actually change the settings of the door so that
Oh.
bees can go in, but it's difficult. It's not impossible, but it's more difficult for them to get out. So
Uh-huh.
usually colonies have sort of 2 entrances on them, and then they'll have, one, so you can close one of them. So bees will come in, but they won't go back out. And that way you can move your colony around. Or in our case, as researchers, when we're using these in the field, we want all of our bees to come back in. So then we can open it up and measure something or collect some data about that colony, for example.
Okay, so they have these valves in some ways. You can control the flow. We're going to come back to these entrances because I think this is a key part of your work. But I do want to raise this question, because I think people think of a bumblebee colony. It founds a nest. The nest grows. They produce. But there is this phenomena that I think is very little known of queen usurpation. Can you tell us, what is this? Does it occur in natural colonies? Tell us about this phenomena.
Yeah, absolutely. So maybe one thing that we could start with before we
Yeah.
jump into the usurpation phenomenon is just a little bit about how the managed colonies are different from a wild colony, even when
Oh,
they're the
good.
same species. So I think the most commonly managed species that we have here is the common eastern bumblebee, Bombus impatiens. That's the one that is most commonly shipped around for commercial pollination services. And so I mentioned before, they're provided in these boxes. There's a lot of workers. There's a queen in there. They've got already some food resources. And the boxes or quads are actually pretty brightly colored. And the entrances are even oftentimes the plastic is made in colors that was really apparent to the visual system of bumblebees so that it's easy for them to locate their colony if we're moving it around to different areas. Contrast to that, we have our wild bumblebee populations, and their colonies are really hard to find. They tend to be really cryptic, again, because I mentioned there's a lot of predators that are out there that would love to come eat the bumblebee larvae and their honey stores and their wax. So often those nests are really cryptic. It's hard to find them, and they have a really predictable seasonal progression that varies a little bit across species, but essentially what we have is early in the season, we have queens that are flying around, they're gathering resources, and they're establishing a new colony somewhere in the landscape. Oftentimes, a lot of these wild bumblebee colonies will use old rodent nests, for example, as a place where they're going to locate their hive. Some build their hives underground or in rotting wood or in stones and other places. But they tend to be very hard to find. And then we have sort of the queens, once they've located what they think is their ideal spot, they'll start to provision their first batch of workers really early in the season. And eventually, once those workers mature and start doing their own foraging, the queen will stop leaving the nest and she'll just maintain her reproductive role in the nest while the workers are then going out and doing all the foraging. And that worker population will grow throughout the season. At some point, new reproductive, so new queens and new drones will be produced. They'll go out and mate in the fall. And then the colony sort of ends up collapsing sometime around the end of the year.
Okay.
That queen dies, the new queens go off and hibernate, and the next year the cycle starts all over.
I think we all here in Oregon and the Pacific Northwest, we always, first, sometimes some of these species are very early, and you see them in February or March, the big queens. And what you're saying, I guess, is that they were born the year before, mated, and then are, just coming out to start that cycle again when we see these big queens flying out.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, and I think the reason why it's important to understand that sort of difference in biology there, and also a little bit about the biology of the normal life cycle of a wild bumblebee colony, is that the usurpation behavior that was so important in our research is, you can understand why queens might engage in this behavior, which is essentially usurpation is just one queen coming in and taking over the nest of another. So essentially usurping the throne of another queen in this case. And that is actually a natural phenomenon that happens. Sometimes it even will happen across different bumblebee species, which is really cool. So why would a queen do this? Why would a queen go out and steal another queen's nest? Well, establishing a nest, doing all of that foraging early in the season when the weather is really cold and poor, building up all of those reserves to make that first batch of workers, that's really costly and it's kind of risky. Things could happen. You could be predated upon. You could experience a bad weather spell early in the spring and die because of a frost while you're out foraging. So as a bed hedging strategy, some queens might emerge a little bit later. And then instead of going out and doing all of that work, they just find the nest of another queen who's already done all of that hard work of locating the ideal spot, doing all the foraging, setting up that early batch of workers, and they just come in and they take over. Of course, the queen who's founded that nest, it doesn't just passively sit there and let that happen. There's actually a battle that happens between those two queens, if it's just those two queens in the nest. And so it's quite a risky strategy, but if you succeed, the payoff is
huge.
The
bonanza.
Yes. So sometimes the usurping queen who's coming in to take over will die because they engage in a sort of battle to the death with the founding queen and they die. But if they succeed, they get a huge reward for all of that. So it's definitely a natural behavior that happens. And again, I mentioned even across species, which is pretty cool. But in the case of so that is normally happening in our wild bumblebee population here.
I just to stop you there for a second, I do remember the old work. I'm everybody knows I'm a Canadian from Alberta, and I remember seeing the old studies by
Richards.
Hawks and Richards,
Yeah.
and they had these nest box, and the thing they would always observe is this pile of dead queens inside the colonies. I was like, holy smokes, it's a little vicious out there. I could understand why a bumblebee might want to hide its nest, not only from predators, but from other bees.
Absolutely. Yeah. So part of being cryptic is, maybe not only something that's important for protecting against predators, but also maybe hiding your nest site from these potential usurpers. So if you think about, then we're going to bring in managed bumblebee colonies, and managed bumblebee colonies are really great for early season pollination of crops like blueberries and strawberries. We're bringing in these whole huge colonies with lots of workers at a time when
Oh,
our wild bumblebee populations are in this nest founding stage. So there's a lot of queens around, and
oh,
they're all looking for good nests and maybe for the opportunity to try to steal somebody else's nest. And now we've brought in a colony that is really visually attractive to bumblebees. It's designed to be visually attractive to bumblebees, and it's above ground. It's very apparent. One thing that's also kind of an interesting feature of bumblebee colonies is they're very smelly and fragrant. They have sort of like a honey, yeasty sort of smell. So they're probably also smelling these colonies that are out there as well.
oh,
But of course, in their biology, when they get these cues, if they were to usurp another queen's nest naturally, that there would be no workers around, or if there was, like, very, very few workers would be in that nest to defend it. But in a managed bumblebee colony, it's very attractive as a cue, and unfortunately, it is filled with workers. So as soon as a wild queen goes to inspect the nest of one of these managed bumblebee colonies, she is immediately swarmed by workers that are ready to defend that colony
oh,
against usurpers. So those queens, as soon as they enter the colony, really stand no chance at all. And I think that was sort of, you mentioned before this observation that other researchers have had about there being these piles of dead queens at the entrances of nests. That was sort of what we saw originally in our research. We had been working on a project where we were, putting bumblebees on farms here. We had some farms that were our controls. We had 11 farmers we were working with that were controls, and 11 farmers who wanted to have bumblebees added onto their farm, and comparing whether or not they were getting much of a benefit from the bumblebees. And we did that first year of the study, and we noticed, like, what the heck is up with all of these dead bumblebees? Like, what is going on? Why do we have so many dead queens in our managed colonies? We were just not expecting that. So we started playing around with different ideas. And an undergrad who had been working on that project with me, Olivia Miller, now Olivia Lobo, she was decided to sort of take this on as her honors thesis project, just to figure out why we had all of these dead bumblebees showing up in our colonies. Originally, we thought, like, oh, maybe our colonies are going reproductive, and then for some reason, those queens that were produced by the colony aren't getting out, and they're just dying in the colony.
uh-huh.
But then we did our homework, of course, and we looked back at all this literature and realized that it could be this more complicated and interesting story, but also one that's like, we were concerned about, because of course, every queen that is wild that comes into our colony thinking it might be able to usurp and dies, that represents a whole potential colony
Oh, yeah.
of bees that our managed colony was killing. So we thought it was really important to follow up on that. And Olivia's subsequent project that turned into this paper that I'm going to talk about today is what led into all of
So
that.
let me get this straight. This was, oftentimes I think about research that we do. You often get a grant to do this thing, and then you notice something, but you can't stop and investigate. This was kind of like one of those following a thread that dropped in your lap, and one could have just like blown past it and done something else, but you guys went back and sort of like pried this open. It's kind of I always love that. That's like the how research ought to be done, is you're kind of like always expecting the unexpected.
Yeah, I mean, I think we were really lucky in this scenario to have such a great team of researchers who were all working on this problem at all different levels. We had a lot of undergrads who were excited about asking different questions and had the skills to sort of work a little independently to figure some things out. And then I don't know if it was a benefit or not, but this all happened. So our first year where we were noticing all this happened was 2019. And then 2020 was the year that this study actually happened. So it was crazy to get this research done during COVID. A big benefit was that it was outside field research. We had to like really fight to make sure that we could get permission to do all of this research. And of course, go through all the hurdles that other researchers had to do their project. So Olivia had to drive in a separate car to all the field sites. For me,
I remember that.
there was a lot of fun logistics for that project, but it was cool to be able to execute it in that year when so much other research couldn't move forward.
I guess, the one thing that, well, that's commendable. And I had almost forgotten about that era. And now, kind of like, oh my God, I do remember that, the single cars and all the kind of hurdles. So that makes this even, doubly impressive. And I guess we'll take a break in a second to describe the research, but I just wanted to highlight like one thing that when the paper came out, people didn't read it, super carefully. They saw the title and they immediately thought, oh, this is about pathogen spread from commercial bumblebee colonies. And what I think is remarkable, which maybe we can just quickly talk about, this is a kind of a different dimension of how commercial bumblebee colonies may be shifting bumblebee communities.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I will even say that that was our intention in our original research project, is we were opening up all of these colonies all the time because we were sampling workers. We were also sampling the wild pollinator community to look for things like pathogen spillover, for example. Another big concern that we have when we're moving managed bumblebee colonies or commercial colonies into these natural settings is that reproductives might escape out and then they would breed with the local populations, and that could cause them to have reduced fitness. For example, if the commercial colonies have genetics that make their phenology a certain progression, and that doesn't match up with the local climatic conditions, for example, that could be an issue. And that's something certainly that we're concerned about when we're bringing managed colonies out. But that had already sort of been somewhat addressed. Like we knew about these issues of spillover of diseases, and we even knew a little bit about the issue of the escaping reproductives with inbreeding with local populations. And there was even a response to that by the industry where they made an excluder so that the reproductive size individuals in a colony, so new queens, wouldn't be able to get out of the colonies. And therefore, that would help a little bit to suppress that from happening.
Okay. All right. That's fantastic. Let's take a quick break. I want to come to the actual study because, as you pointed out, there are these other dimensions that people had worked on and industry had responded with some solutions. But I want to hear maybe hear about the study that we're setting up today, but also the way in which industry has responded. So let's take a quick break and we'll be right back.
Sounds good.
Okay, we're back. Tell us about this study. What was you made these observations? Tell us about what you were measuring, how you sort of framed the question and the study design.
Sure. So one thing I mentioned before in our earlier segment, that it could have been that the queens we were observing that were dead, they could have come from within our colonies that we had for this earlier study. So what we really wanted to isolate was, where are these queens coming from? Can we be sure that these are wild queens that are coming into our colonies and then dying there? Is that so they're the source of this enormous population of dead queens that we were finding in the study? And so what we did is we took those existing excluders that I mentioned in the last segment that were used originally to prevent the reproductives from leaving the colony. And we fit those on our colonies in a way so that not only would large individuals like queens not be able to leave the colony, but also they wouldn't be able to get into the colony either, which
Okay.
been a little bit of changing from how things are normally on a colony. Normally, when we have an excluder, it only is on that outgoing entrance, and the in entrance is still wide open. Anything can get in. So what
Huh.
we did is we fully reduced everything down to just one entrance on our test colony that we were putting out. And again, we got a set of farms where we put out two different colonies. One colony that had this excluder on it so that
Ah.
large queens could not get in, and another colony that was just the normal way a grower would receive their colonies. And then we could compare which colony ended up with a lot of dead queens. If they both had a lot of dead queens in them, then probably those queens are coming from within the colony. There's new reproductives.
Smart.
We were also really careful when we set up this study to do a thorough inventory of our colonies at the start of the study. So every colony that we got, we opened up and we looked to see, okay, it does just have one live queen and there's no queen cells that are being produced by that colony. And we have sort of we also marked our original queen that was there in the colony just in case, something would happen to her before we put everything out. So then the idea was to sort of go along throughout the season, put these colonies out and check them periodically to see when are we starting to see these dead queens accumulating, and are they equal between the two, or is there a difference between our colony that has the excluder, which should prevent things from getting in, versus our normal standard control colony that we were using. We also did a couple other measures while we had our colonies out there on the farms. So for example, we surveyed things like the number of queens that we were seeing on that farm doing nest searching behavior. We also looked at some of the features of queens that other researchers had identified as being important in driving usurpation behavior, like the size of the queen. So you might expect queens that are a little bit bigger, more robust. Maybe they're going to be better at usurping a colony, or maybe it could be that tiny queens who don't have as good a chance at founding their own colony will be more likely to engage in that risky behavior of trying to take over somebody else's colony along the way. So we had a couple different measures that we were looking at while we were monitoring those colonies along.
I love it because you have both a kind of a sense of what's inside, but you also took into account what was happening outside, and it allows you to, impute causation a lot more carefully with this kind of controlled study. And I love that feature that you were able to sort of like prevent. You have a one where usurpation is not occurring by putting that little cattle guard in front, and the other one where that if a usurper kind of found the entrance, she'd be able to get inside. That's a great design. That seems like something that would be able to resolve this. So tell us what you found.
Yeah, we were pretty excited about it because originally we were thinking like, oh man, we're going to have to maybe come up with a way to do like some genetic analysis to figure out like were the queens that were dead related to the queens. But then we're like, oh no, there's this really simple tool that we can use. We can put it
Oh my God.
Then we don't have to do any kind of like fancy lab work in genetics. We can just see where these queens are coming from, inside or outside. And it turned out to be like a really very clean example of results. So in this case, we had almost no wild queens that died in our colonies that had this excluder on them, and lots of wild queens that were dying in our colonies that were our sort of standard control colonies. And I say almost no, because there was one site where one day we accidentally, after visiting the colony, left the excluder open for a day. And when we went back, because we had realized, oh shoot, there was some dead queens in there. So it's almost the example of like
within a day.
Yes, within a day. Yeah.
Wow.
So, and it ended up being, this was really commonly happening. So there was like multiple different, I think it was 3 queens for every 4 days we were killing on average. Some of our colonies in the 2-week period that we had them out had 20 dead queens in them. It was quite a
Oh my
lot. And
goodness.
again, thinking back that every one of those queens that we're killing, that's wild, that represents later in the season a whole potential colony that could be dying.
So there was never. This is kind of shocking result. Was there ever a case where the usurper took over? The colonies were just too big. They always got schmucked.
I will say, when we were sort of like figuring out like how could this all work and everything in the lab, we tested what would happen because we wanted to see. It was very rare that we would see when we walked up in the field
Oh
a
yeah, right.
queen trying to get in. We did occasionally, and there is a little video in the supplement of our paper that shows how effective these excluders are, because there's a wild queen just trying her darndest to get into one of these colonies with an excluder, and she can't. But we were
Huh.
wondering, like, well, what happens when they do get in? Like, do they get in and then they walk around and then maybe they have a chance that they could get back out? Like,
Yeah,
how many are going in but then just coming back out and not
yeah.
dying? And based on our little experiment where we took a queen and we introduced it into one of these colonies, I would say there's very little chance that
Oh,
that queen is going to come back out alive. So almost immediately upon crossing the threshold of the entrance, that queen is swarmed by some of the defensive guard workers, and she's just stung to death almost immediately. So,
wow.
yeah.
Here's a nerdy question. What about uh, people know that there are bumblebees that make a living at this, cuckoo bees that are kind of more armored. Did they ever succeed in these big colonies?
We actually didn't see any
See any?
cookies at all.
Okay.
So we had these colonies out for only a 2-week period. So it could have
Hmm.
been maybe that it was just too short.
Right.
In our other bigger project where we were looking at pollination, we did encounter a couple of the cuckoo bee species, but they weren't very common in our region. It could be, of course, like maybe there's some cycling of populations and we just missed that. But yeah, I don't
Well,
know
I
if there's
guess
anything. Go
no.
ahead.
No. I guess it raises the other question: is these are eastern bumblebee colonies. Was it primarily eastern bumblebee queens that were usurping, or did you see this kind of other species making their way in?
We did get one example of another species coming in. So in this case, in one of our colonies, we found a Bombus perplexus queen that was dead in our colony. So we definitely saw a little bit of evidence for this cross species usurpation behavior, but also, and will perhaps be not so surprising to some folks who are familiar with these commercial bumblebee colonies or even honeybee colonies, is that we also saw a range of other things that showed up in our colonies. So for example, there were a lot of honeybees that were showing up in our bumblebee colonies. And of course, these are all, again, only the ones that we were observing that were dead in our
Uh-huh.
study. So they
Really?
could be that they're more able to sneak in and out. There were some wasps. There was a small metallic sweat bee in there. There was like all manner of other things that were probably also going in there, but in this case, not with the intention of taking over the
Uh-huh.
hive, like the queens would be of the bumblebees, but probably just to go in and like steal some resources and some of that honey or pollen that the bumblebees were collecting and take that back to their own colony.
Well, this is a shocking finding, and I guess a lot of concern, to the continued use of commercial bumblebees in this situation. Is there any remedy? Tell us when talk to the industry about this. What was their response?
Yeah, so I was really pleasantly surprised by how quickly the industry was able to respond to this. So, of the two major bumblebee suppliers, Plant Products, which I think folks might know more familiarly as BioBest, they
Uh-huh.
right away were really interested in the research and wanted to know what changes they could make. And I think that the cool thing is about these, having these excluders we were already working with and showing that they could provide this really good solution that would prevent
Right.
wild from getting in. So normally you might just have this size reducer only on the outgoing entrance. But what we're suggesting and what the industry is now moving towards adopting is to have this size reducer on both openings so that workers can get in and out and that queens can either get in or go out. So early in the season, we don't get usurping, and late in the season, we don't get reproductives leaving the colony. We tried to understand in our study if there would be impacts of having that reducer. So we compared some colony metrics like reproductives, overall size of the colony, number of workers, things like survival of the queen that was inside between our control colony and our colony with the excluder. And we didn't see any differences. But I know BioBest was doing a lot of research this past growing season, implementing these double reducers and seeing if there are effects on things like pollination services, for example, which is, I think, one important other aspect of this research is when we're originally conducting this much larger pollination study to see if supplementing these bumblebee colonies on farms would provide beneficial pollination services for growers. But actually, what we found when we looked at the data was that visitation by bumblebees was actually lower on farms that had bumblebee colonies at them. And of course, that's a very perplexing response. And we were really confused by this until we paired it together with this usurpation research.
Oh, of course, because there was fewer wild colonies.
Yes, so that's the kind of mechanism that we're thinking could happen, is that if we're killing 20 or more wild queens in just this short period, we're having bumblebee colonies out early in the season, we're probably having a population level impact. And that could be why we're seeing fewer wild bumblebees visiting. We didn't see a big difference in other kinds of bees that would be visiting. Our focal crop for this study was tomatoes. So we didn't see any other difference in things like lasioglossum or metallic sweat bees like aguachlorellas, those were pretty equal. But bumblebees, and those are mostly in our area, Bombus impatiens, were significantly lower in both years where we were measuring visitation at sites that had these bumblebee colonies earlier in the spring.
So that makes sense that might be the cause, because if it was some kind of general impact, you would expect all other taxa of bees to go down. But just the fact that the bumblebees, it does lend credence to this idea that the lack of those excluders on the entrances and the usurpation is depleting the population, and so that the grower doesn't have these bumblebees on their crop kind of defeats the purpose in the. Okay, that's fascinating.
The next natural follow-up to this would be now to compare some farms that have no bumblebee colonies to farms that have the regular, standard bumblebee colonies as they were without the excluders, and then ones that have bumblebees, but they have an excluder. So that way we can compare and see, is it the ones that, maybe it's something just about the bumblebees, maybe they are spreading pathogens or something else, or maybe it's about this queen killing through usurpation that's driving a difference in crop visitation.
Amazing for a pandemic restricted casual observation it's just the kind of clarity that has come out of this work is really remarkable. I think all our listeners commend you on and your team for doing this.
Awesome. Well, I feel super lucky to have sort of had, made this observation and to have been part of a team where we could really quickly devote some resources to answering it, even in a challenging environment. And I think the undergraduate student who'd worked on that, Olivia, really, she deserves a lot of credit for digging through all of these tons and tons of bumblebee nests and counting every dead worker and measuring features of them, like their body size, for example.
Well, shout out to you, Olivia. Good job. Let's take a quick break. We haven't done the segment for a while, the 3-question segment. So let's do it.
Sounds good to me.
We're back. The segment is on. I did not let you know about this earlier, so we're gonna this is gonna be like rapid fire. So the first question I ask guests is, do you have a recommended book for our listeners?
I do. I mean, I guess I'm torn a little bit between two books, and this will
Ooh.
probably reach different segments of your audience, which is The Bees in Your Backyard. I'm looking at my bookshelf right now and thinking like, what are the books that I think like would be great to recommend? I feel like that's one that for anybody, that's a really accessible book that like you can learn a lot. And just I think the images of the bees in there are so captivating and so beautiful. They just make you want to learn so much more
I
about these
I
fascinating
always
creatures.
delight in remarking that I was talking with Olivia, and Princeton University Press called it the Harry Potter of natural history guides.
I love that. Yes. Okay, but so then my paired recommendation for that, which will appeal, I think, to some of the more like dorky or academic folks among your listeners, would be the R for Data Science book. I feel
Oh.
like that is one, and I will almost say that's like kind of cheating to say that it's a book because it's actually fully available for free online. But so much of, like what I do is I'm spending time, like it's fun to do these field studies, especially in, pandemic conditions, et cetera. But most of what I do on a day-to-day basis is I'm sitting in my office at my computer with probably multiple R project windows open, like doing data analysis. So the R for Data Science has been a book that like I use all the time. And usually I actually go to the website and I'm figuring out some things, through that. So that has been a great resource
Well,
for me.
listeners may not, who aren't R users, it's the letter R. And I guess the thing is why do there's all sorts of software out there. Why do you like to do, because I guess what we're talking about when you have all of this data and you have all this variation, you're trying to say, are there more bees here or more bees there? You have to test these things statistically. And why do you like, I mean, I remember when I first saw R, I was intimidated because the old days you had drag and drop. Here you have to like type.
Yeah, you
It
gotta
seems
do
like we've
a
gone
little bit
backwards in
of
some ways. Yeah,
it's a
yeah.
little bit of coding. You gotta, learn the language a little bit, but it's so powerful because it's an open source framework. So of course there's other, statistical softwares that one might use that are easier to learn, but they just have these specific tools that they implement. And if your data or your question isn't, applicable to that set of analyses, then you're sort of out of luck. Whereas with R, that community is always developing all the time. And there's researchers and scientists and computer scientists all over the world who are contributing all the time these new different applications and packages to this environment called R that allows you to make beautiful figures and do complex analyses and ask new kinds of questions that we might not have been able to ask before. So, for example, like I can pull a phylogeny of the bees and bring that into a community data set that I have and ask about how land use around a farm is related to different taxa of bees being more or less abundant on that farm based on their evolutionary history, which is pretty cool and not something you can do with a lot of other platforms.
And that's a great description of it. The Swiss Army knife of all sorts of data analysis. And thanks for the book recommendation. I'm sure there's a lot of graduate students out there who are, in agony right now learning R, and they're really grateful for the book recommendation.
It will pay off, and it gets better if you're in that agony. So,
Just
yeah,
like War and Peace.
yeah.
Okay, so then I don't know, maybe R is your go-to tool, but do you have a go-to tool
Well,
for the kind of work you do?
the other go-to tool that I would say that I just so appreciate from my whole time as like an early career researcher who's working on bees that I still use, I was just using yesterday, is the Discover Life keys that are available online for bees. So that's a system of keys that are unlike your sort of traditional keys where you have this set of two different options. And often there are no pictures and there's just a weird
Description.
esoteric description that nobody except for the person that wrote it really understands, with lots of strange words like trochanterol flocculus and other things that you're like, what even is that? Whereas the Discover Life key is great because if you don't understand something, you could just skip to the next thing. Or let's say your insect you're looking at is like mangled and it's missing the leg that you need that has that character, you can skip to a new character. And there's lots of pictures. So a lot of I think that's a huge shout out to all of the taxonomists that have gone through that labor of love of putting, all of these keys that we're used to using as taxonomists and systematists into this much more accessible framework so that we can identify all of these diverse specimens that we're collecting and then learn more about what's shaping their biology and their populations over time.
I think it's a great tool, and I do love the way that you can simplify things. Like you may lack the terminology, but you understand race car green, and then you hit that and simplify it, and then it gives you some other options, and then you may need to look at wing venation or something, and then you can simplify it again, and then you're left maybe with a complicated character that you can then look up rather than have to look up every step. It's always frustrating when you're in a dichotomous key and you're already in the wrong direction and you're agonizing over a couplet that doesn't matter to you. It's not, you're in the wrong place. And it's just like, it avoids this suffering in silence that I think a lot of us who are trying to learn wild bee taxonomy helps us kind of get moving.
Yeah. So I would say I have a huge debt of gratitude to all of the taxonomists who have personally helped me along the way, and then to ones who have just contributed to these collective resources that have helped push forward our entire field of working on bees.
Thanks. That's a great shout out to the taxonomists, the few specialists that we have. They're very, very precious to all of us. Well, that brings us to the last question. Do you have a favorite pollinator species?
I do. I've had a favorite that I first encountered, I think in my like second year of grad school. And it was a bee that is in my system that I was working on at the time of strawberry, but turns out not to be a very important pollinator at all. But the first time I saw it, I was just fascinated by it. And its name is Osmia bucephala. And it just has an enormous head. Its head is so big. So of course it's like a nice fuzzy sort of metallic-y midnight blue osmia type bee, but it's just got this big chunky head. And when I saw it, it was not visiting my strawberry flowers, but it was actually cutting little leaves off of the leaves of my strawberry plants and then carrying those away to its nest site somewhere else beyond my field. But I did collect a few specimens over the years, and they're just such an incredibly unique looking, just cute, fuzzy bee that, yeah, I'm fascinated by them. And I think there may be among the bees where like, it's wild how little we know about some of these bees.
Oh, I would, yeah, absolutely. I think if the taxonomists are precious because we still don't know the distribution, or even some specimens are just, some species are described by, 4 or 5 specimens, then the natural history is even more opaque. But so both the males and the females have these kind of disproportionately large heads?
Yeah, they both have pretty big heads. So in the field, I only ever saw the females.
Female.
We do have a nice insect collection here at Cornell, and there are very few Osmia bucephalas in it, but there are 1 or 2 males, and they do have a little bit above average head size. But I would say it's most apparent in the females, and they almost look a little bit like a bumblebee worker. They're so fuzzy. But then their heads are just so big. And like, why? Why do they have such big heads? I don't
That's
know.
always a question.
I would love to know.
Bucephala's got to be the Latin for big head.
Yeah,
It's got to
right?
be.
Yeah, something, cephalic, that's definitely head. I don't know what the blue part is. My old Latin teacher would probably keep going for now, but yeah. So, and like, there's many other common bees. Andrina nasonii is one that that's probably the bee I've collected the most of in my career. Really common in strawberry fields, and I've done some studies focused individually on that species and realized we don't know anything about where it nests. We don't know how specialized it is. It's definitely likes strawberry a lot more than other bees, but it would be cool to, have the ability to focus a little bit more on the natural history of some of these bees that are really clearly important agricultural pollinators like Andrina nasonii that we know so little about.
It's amazing. Well, I'm really glad to have had this conversation with you. You have revealed a key piece of natural history in this study that has big implications in terms of crop pollination. So thanks so much for taking the time to talk with us today.
Well, it was a pleasure to chat with you and to share this work with your audience.
Thank you so much for listening. Show notes with links from each episode are available at the website pollinationpodcast.oregonstate.edu. I also love hearing from you, and there's a form at the website where you can pop in and say hello and give me feedback. If you want to support the show, remember to leave a rating on iTunes, Spotify, or whatever podcast mothership you use. And finally, if you have the means and you want to help support my lab's effort to document bee biodiversity in Oregon, visit OregonBeeAtlas.org and follow down to the donate button where you can make a tax-deductible donation to the Jerry and Judith Paul Native Pollinator Endowment. Every little bit helps. See you next episode.